Hi everyone, we're going to start talking about the second half of Kennedy and the Cold War, which is about the crisis over Cuba. So in 1959, Fidel Castro wins the revolution and he enacts a communist dictatorship in Cuba. He joins forces and becomes allies with the Soviet Union. The history between Cuba and the United States is a long and complex one. I attached a video to the assignment that you're more than welcome to view, and I highly suggest you do, that gives you a little more background knowledge and understanding about the United States' relationship with Cuba and how that comes into play when we look at Bay of Pigs and even the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, Bay of Pigs. The United States is not happy that their containment policy has failed, that they feel like they're on the edge of losing the Cold War when their neighbor, 90 miles south of them, becomes a communist nation. JFK, during his campaign, criticized the Eisenhower administration for allowing a communist nation to form so close to the United States. So, the CIA, under Eisenhower's administration, had started a secret invasion plan to use Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and try to overthrow Castro. When JFK becomes president, he inherits this operation. JFK canceled the promised air support to deny U.S. involvement with the Bay of Pigs. He changed the location. He did a few things to kind of alter the plan. Ultimately, JFK really thought that anti-Castro uprising would occur and they would join the invaders of exiled Cubans. And that didn't happen. It was a colossal failure. The Castro and his army were not surprised by the invasion. They quickly squashed it down. No one joined the invaders. So it just really failed. And it really embarrassed JFK and made him look really incompetent. The result, too, was that Castro used that event to really sensationalize the defeat and to the media, and it kind of boosted his popularity in Cuba, and this strengthened that relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union. So the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets began to supply nuclear weapons to Cuba, and JFK had warned the Soviets that the United States would not tolerate this. And on October 14th, the United States was conducting their U-2 spy planes, and a photo showed missile launching pads in Cuba. And by October 22nd, JFK informed the nation that there were launch pads in Cuba aimed at the United States. An attack from Cuba, everyone recognized, would mean all-out attack on the Soviets. So if the Cubans attacked us, we would be attacking the Soviet Union. So this was the brink of war. We were at the brink of World War III. At any moment, someone could press a button and we would have a world disaster with nuclear weapons. So this was a 6-day, really tense affair. Soviet ships started heading to Cuba with nuclear weapons. And JFK orders a quarantine of Cuba for 6 days. Now, this quarantine was pretty much a blockade, but a blockade is an aggressive act for war, so he called it a quarantine. And the Soviet ships, they stopped short of the quarantine. They were eye to eye, American Navy ships and Soviet ships. And ultimately, no one made a wrong move, and the Soviets agreed to remove missiles if the United States would not invade Cuba. And both sides ultimately were criticized for not solving this problem sooner with private talks. Now, we're going to look at the primary source analysis assignment that you're going to do for this section. So the first thing is we're going to read a textbook passage and answer the questions. So something I always like to do is go to those questions first. So the first question, let me see. So for the first thing, this is just a summary. So after the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Soviet Union gave Cuba more weapons. In October 1962, President Kennedy learned that the Soviets were secretly building missile bases on the island. If the bases were completed, the atomic missiles could reach American cities within minutes. Kennedy announced that American warships would stop any Soviet ship from carrying missiles. The world waited tensely as Soviet ships steamed toward Cuba. At the last minute, the Soviet ships turned back. We were eyeball to eyeball, says Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and I think the other fellow just blinked. Kennedy's, and that's kind of a reference to that brinkmanship that we talked about in the Eisenhower administration. Kennedy's strong standing led to the Soviets to compromise. The Soviets agreed to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States promised not to invade the island. Still, the Cuban Missile Crisis has shaken both American and Soviet officials. In all the years of the Cold War, the world never came as close to a full-scale nuclear war. So the first document is a letter from the president or chairman of the Soviet Union to President Kennedy. And so after we read this letter, what we're going to be looking for is what deal does Khrushchev, I don't say his name right, I'm so sorry. I practiced saying it before. Propose to Kennedy. What's the tone of this letter? Do you think he has the upper hand? Why or why not? So let's look at that letter. Washington, October 27th, 1962. Oh, I'm reading Kennedy's. All right, Moscow. Dear Mr. President, I understand your concern for the security of the United States. You wish to ensure the security of your country, and this is understandable, but Cuba too wants the same thing. All countries want to maintain their security. But how are we, the Soviet Union, to understand the fact that you have surrounded the Soviet Union with military bases, surrounded our allies with military bases, and placed military bases literally around our country and stationed your missiles armaments there? This is no secret. Your missiles are located in Britain, are located in Italy, and are aimed at us. Your missiles are located in Turkey. You are disturbed over Cuba. You say this disturbs you because it's 90 miles by sea from the coast of the United States of America, but you have placed destructive missiles, weapons, which you call offensive, in Turkey, literally next to us. I therefore make this proposal. We are willing to remove from Cuba the missiles which you regard as offensive. Your representatives will make the declaration to the effect that the United States, for its part, will remove its missiles from Turkey. We, in making this pledge, will promise not to invade Turkey. The United States government will promise not to invade Cuba. The greatest joy for all peoples would be an agreement of the announcement of our agreement. These are my proposals, Mr. President. Respectfully yours. And so again, if you look at those questions, what deal does he propose to Kennedy? What's the tone of his letter? Use a quote to support that. And do you think he has the upper hand? Why or why not? Now, the document B is the letter from President Kennedy to Chairman Khrushchev. And let's read these three questions. In this letter, Kennedy restates his proposals, Khrushchev's proposals. Does Kennedy include everything he proposed? If not, why might he left something out? What is the tone of this letter? Provide a quote to support your claim. Do you think Kennedy has the upper hand? Why or why not? So let's go to Kennedy's letter. Dear Mr. Chairman, I read your letter of October 26 with great care and welcome the statement of your desire to seek a prompt solution to this problem. As I read your letter, the key elements of your proposal were as follows. You would agree to remove these weapons from Cuba under the appropriate United Nations observation and supervision and halt the further introduction of such weapon systems into Cuba. We on our part would agree to promptly remove the blockade now in effect and to give assurances against an invasion of Cuba. I am confident that other nations of the Western Hemisphere would be prepared to do likewise. There is no reason why we should not be able to complete these arrangements and announce them to the world within a couple of days. The effect of such a settlement on the easing world tensions would enable us to work towards a more general agreement regarding the other armaments as proposed in your letter. But in this first step, let me emphasize is the cessation of work on missile sites in Cuba. The continuation of this threat by linking these problems to be a broader question of European and world security would surely be a grave risk to the peace of our world. For this reason, I hope we can quickly agree along with the lines outlined in this letter and in your letter on October 26, JFK. And so the last question, last article with questions. Russian ambassador cable to the Soviet Foreign Ministry. What new information do you learn from Robert Kennedy? Why do you think this exchange happened in a private meeting rather than an official letter? Remember, document B was published in the New York Times. How do you think Robert Kennedy felt during this meeting? Provide evidence. So the Russian ambassador cable to the Soviet foreign minister. Late last night, Robert Kennedy invited me to come see him. We talked alone. Kennedy stated The United States government is determined to get rid of those bases in Cuba, up to an extreme case of bombing them, since, I repeat, they pose a great threat to the security of the United States. In response, I'm sure the Soviets will respond and a real world war will begin, in which millions of Americans and Russians will die. We want to avoid that in any way we can, and I'm sure that the government of the USSR has the same wish. The most important thing for us is to get an agreement as soon as possible with the Soviet government to halt further work on the construction of the missile bases in Cuba and take measures under international control that would make it impossible to use these weapons. And what about Turkey? I asked Robert Kennedy. If that is the only obstacle to achieving the rules I mentioned earlier, then the president doesn't see any difficulties in resolving this issue, replied R. Kennedy. The greatest difficulty for the president is the public discussion of the issue of Turkey. The deployment of missile bases in Turkey was officially done by a special decision of the NATO Council. To announce now a unilateral decision by the president of the U.S. to withdraw missile bases from Turkey, this would damage the entire structure of NATO and the U.S. position as a leader of NATO. However, President Kennedy is ready to come to an agreement on that question with the president of Russia. I think that in order to withdraw these bases from Turkey, we need about 4 to 5 months. However, the president can't say anything public in regard to Turkey. R. Kennedy then warned that his comments about Turkey were extremely confidential. Besides him and his brother, only 2 to 3 people know about it in Washington. The president also asked that Russia give him an answer within the next day, Kennedy said in conclusion. All right, so complete that assignment, and then we'll switch back over to our PowerPoint. And you'll watch a Cuban Missile Crisis video, and you need to be looking for these questions. Why did Kennedy call his actions a quarantine? How did the U.S. keep track of Soviet actions? What could a photo interpreter do? How did the Americans learn that there were missiles in Cuba? What was Kennedy advised to do, and how the crisis ended? And the crisis over Berlin. Since the Berlin airlift, about 3 million Eastern Germans had fled to West Berlin to escape communism and its oppression. They advertise, these refugees from Eastern Germany, they kind of advertise the failures of East Germany's communist government. And they also weakened the East Germany's economy because there was less people coming. There's 20% of their population fled. And a lot of those people that fled were intellectuals, business leaders, people who had the means to flee. The Soviets threatened to close all access to West Berlin, and JFK refused to give up access routes to West Berlin. And so the Soviets surprised the world by enacting the Berlin Wall to stop refugees from fleeing to freedom in West Berlin. This kind of went up really quick in the middle of the night. They started making it, and it became a symbol of Cold War tension between the East and West, and it really aggravated tensions. And if you look, here's a video about the Berlin Wall, and you can kind of see the different aspects, the barriers, the electric fences, the vehicle traps, and just how dangerous it was. And where was the wall located? Because I think that's something that's actually curious as well. I always kind of thought the wall was keeping East Germany, was around East Germany, but it's actually around West Germany, which I thought was interesting because that was something new I learned. And what did the wall symbolize? And so both these leaders start to realize that their actions can have really direct consequences on mankind. And so they start searching for ways to ease tensions. And one way they do that is by establishing a hotline, a direct phone between the White House and the Soviet Union. And they also enacted a limit test ban treaty, which banned testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. So this was some progress made. Now, I'm going to stop this video right here, but there is going to be a second part of this video that's going to talk about the new frontier, the space race, and ultimately the assassination of JFK. So please click on the second video to watch that as well.